Melanie Bolus here, doing my summary for chapters 2 and 11 this week. Chapter 2 is the legal, ethical, and professional responsibility in assessments. The first thing to talk about is the federal requirements. If a school accepts money from the federal government, then they must also follow the regulations and requirements set forth by the government. There are two categories of requirements, and those are the large-scale assessments for accountability purposes, and those would be to see, are they learning what they're supposed to at that grade level. The other category would be related to families with children with special needs, be it physical, mental, behavioral disturbances, or cultural or linguistic disabilities. The ESEA, or Elementary and Secondary Education Act, says that each state will negotiate how it will be acceptable. They can decide what they want to do with their assessments to make sure they meet those federal guidelines. And progress must be shown for all of the students with an emphasis on reading and math. The data must be made available to parents and the public. And there is pressure on the early childhood educators to prepare students for these accountability measures. A teacher needs to keep those in mind when she's preparing the students and teaching that they need to be ready for these assessments. Some states have federally funded preschool programs, and they have their own accountability. They're not accountable in the same way as a kindergarten through 12 facility would be. The federal requirements for students with special needs are that the pre-K to primary age children are all entitled to a free public education in the least restrictive environment and assessed in the language that they know best. The parents are notified and informed. Parents are notified, and they need their informed consent for placement and planning. Parents may request an evaluation if a teacher hasn't already done that. They may request their child to be re-evaluated or get an independent evaluation outside of the school system. Those are all their rights that they can do with evaluations. Parents have the right to review records, obtain copies of those records, challenge any info, questionable info, or have that the questionable information withdrawn if they feel like it's not an accurate portrayal of their child. The parents must give written permission before a student's records are released to anyone else. Many linguistically and culturally fair assessment tools should be used to identify and place those children. Not just one assessment tool, but there should be several assessments used to be able to place them where they need to be. The information should be documented and carefully considered by the teacher. Accommodations and alternate assessments must be available for students with disabilities who take part in state and district-wide assessment programs. Young students must have an IEP prepared by an education team, and that team could consist of teachers, special education teachers, parents, and other involved persons, such as specialists that child might see on a regular basis. There should be inclusive education. Inclusion of students with special needs need to be as fully included as possible in all aspects of their education in the least restrictive environment. The RTI, or response to intervention, is a strategy for distinguishing between students who may struggle to learn and those who are actually learning disabled. Every child that is not up to their developmental or their grade level learning does not mean that they necessarily have a learning disability, and the response to intervention would help distinguish that. There are also state and local requirements, keeping in mind that the federal requirements always trump the state and local requirements. Those need to fall under that category and submit to those federal guidelines. For the state requirements, many states have their own tests that align with their standards. Like such as Ohio, we have our Ohio Learning Standards. So we could have tests that are specific to those standards. But some schools some schools use standardized achievement tests. Some states don't have a funded preschool program, and others are rigorously monitored. At the local level, teachers need to know who is supposed to see what files and for what purpose, and they need to know the local procedures for documenting and reporting information. They also need to know if their district has a policy of what is to be included in the portfolio. Next, assessments should all be valid, reliable, and fair. For reliability, that's the extent to which an assessment technique yields results that are accurate and consistent over time. Assessment situations should be non-threatening and supportive. The questions and the requests should be clear and understandable. They should be following the directions exactly as they are stated, and the teacher needs to make sure those directions are clear. The teacher needs to be alert of the impact of environmental distractions on how a student performs on those tests. And they need to check to see if the results seem consistent with that student's overall capabilities. How the student feels on that given day may influence their performance. Maybe they're physically not feeling well, or they just found out last night that grandpa died, or maybe they're really hungry. All of that could affect their performance on a test, and that needs to be kept in mind. And the reliability of an assessment also should keep in mind that we are using more than one assessment of the same behavior, and that also makes it more reliable instead of just counting on one particular assessment. Next, the validity of the assessments is the extent an assessment technique fulfills the purpose that it's intended, and that is to provide accurate information about an item under consideration. There should be enough samples to represent the behavior. The samples should be balanced. The information should be obtained in different ways, and that should all converge together. The assessment needs to make sure it's measuring what is intended. There was an example in the book about a seed experiment done with young children, and it was about patterning. And some of those students maybe could do that pattern, but they didn't have the fine motor skills. Their fine motor skill capability wasn't of such that they could use the small seeds that were given to them to do patterning well, where that assessment would have been better if they had used a different material for patterning. And so we need to make sure that it's measuring what they actually intend. They weren't trying to measure their fine motor skills, and those kind of were being measured on that. They just needed to know if they could pattern. Also, there needs to be fairness in the assessments, no biases, and that refers to the test, the procedure, the result, or a use that unfairly discriminates against one group in favor of another. And those groups could be something like low-income families or low-income students, English language learners, or students from a minority culture. And we need to make sure that that the tests are something that don't unfairly discriminate against any of those groups, the assessments. For students with disabilities, the teachers need to be careful not to over-identify problems. The fairness factor would come in there as well. They don't want to just lump every kid who has a behavior problem into being ADHD or having some diagnosed behavior. Sometimes it's just a behavior problem. And dealing with students who need a challenge, advanced placement students, students that might be older, advanced development students, some who might be older, some who might be gifted or talented. Designating students as gifted should be done very carefully, because that does put pressure on the student to perform in a certain way, and we need to make sure they really are considered gifted. instead of just maybe them being gifted in one tiny area and us labeling them as gifted in everything. The students are from diverse social, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds, and we need to keep in mind that teachers and administrators also come from diverse backgrounds. So we've got all this diversity happening, and we need to make sure that we are being fair and that all those factors are kept in mind. A teacher must acknowledge and understand the influence that a sociocultural background has on the assessment and how it influences that, and how those cultural differences and socioculture backgrounds shapes a child's development, whether keeping in mind the independent versus a culture that may value cooperation more. And a culture might emphasize a certain area, maybe, for example, large motor development. So that child is really advanced in that because their culture really prizes that particular feature. We need to find personnel who can interpret the results of assessments in culturally responsible ways. And we need to use tests that are technically acceptable and culturally and linguistically appropriate. Using multiple assessment measures in a supportive, familiar context should happen. We need to use verbal and nonverbal measurements. We should rephrase, restate, or restate our expectation of the task if needed, or change the context to be familiar so the child understands us, not just us assessing them, asking a question, and if they answer wrongly, we need to be willing to rephrase and restate and let them try that task again. Assessments need to use the interest and activities linked to the child's sociocultural setting for them to be successful. We also need to stress the similarities in the students in our assessment and instruction instead of just focusing on our differences. Try to find those similarities. For dual language and ELL students, the assessment should be done by a bilingual, bicultural adult who knows the child if it is possible. And the assessment should be done in both English and their home language. Assessments to get information on English language proficiency should be done, and school-related content. Except for the subject of English, the teacher should use their home language, should accept a mixture of languages or their home language as an appropriate response in their assessments. For teachers, with assessments, we need to follow professional and ethical guidelines. We need to be objective, try to obtain and use facts, information, or data without our personal feelings getting in the way, or our personal beliefs, or prejudging children. We need to avoid categories and labels like, oh, there's the ADHD child, or just always calling that person the shy child, or this person's a troublemaker. Try to avoid those labels and categories. Those can be damaging to the children. Confidentiality needs to be maintained. We need to keep in mind that the parents must give permission for release of any of the information to anyone besides the parent themselves or the educational institution. We need to share information only with staff that need to know, not make it a gossip session in the teacher's lounge. The records should be kept in a file away from other people being able to see them, and probably a locked file, but a file close to your desk where you can keep an eye on that to keep it confidential. We need to use the results of an assessment in appropriate ways. We need to know our limitations of each and guard against over-reliance on the assessments. We need to use the assessment results for the intended purposes. To make decisions about our teaching and learning what's needs to happen in future learning, and maybe things that we're deficient in our learning that's already been taking place. We should also, one of the intended purposes would be to identify significant concerns for an individual student, or helping a program to improve educational and developmental interventions. Communities with and those interventions that I just mentioned, maybe helping the community know how to better help the families, and professionals in the school knowing better how to help them and intervene on their behalf, and also the administrator. Inappropriate uses of these assessment tools would be to retain a child in a grade, or delay their entrance to kindergarten, or placing them in a specific track, like, oh, these are the slow learners, or recommending a student for a special program just based on an assessment. We need to keep a broader view than just a few assessments. Now we move on to Chapter 11, Communicating and Collaborating Using Assessment Procedures and Results. First, we'll talk about communicating with the children. The teachers and students should be having conferences to discuss their progress as part of assessment and teaching. The students can edit and revise writing in these conferences, and the children should be congratulated specifically on what they're doing well and on these conferences. And then in communication with the parents, it should begin before parent-teacher conferences, and or before any kind of a grade card or progress report comes out. We need to have clear communication with them. Part of our communication would be to inform and involve. We need to get their opinions on their child and what's going on, and to explain reasons for our assessments. We need to show them their portfolios and reasons why some items are kept. And the goal should be for the home and the work and the school to work together for the students' benefit, and we need to communicate that. Part of our communication would be to collect sufficient evidence. The parents can report on the behavior, and we can report on their behavior at school and their subjects, like their social. We can also report on things like their social interactions and work habits. We don't want to just concentrate on their letter grades, but also how are they doing in other areas. Also, we can communicate. We should be communicating in several ways. There are different ways to report to the parents, and one is informally, by the work that is displayed or sent home, notes, phone messages, emails. And then there are formal ways to communicate, which would be parent-teacher conferences, grade cards, reports, letters, test scores, and summarizing and interpreting the portfolios. There's a summary or summative evaluations. And in our book, it said that teachers don't typically like those. I guess I'll find out. There is a criterion referenced evaluation under that category that is comparing the students to a standard or expected outcome. And then there's a norm referenced, which would be comparing students with other students. And then there's a narrative report, which is emphasizing their strengths and communicating concerns and recommendations. And we should be comparing that to their previous work and standards and their universal growth and development. Grading and grade cards are part of that summary evaluations, and they're useful in describing what has been achieved and what is yet to learn. The grades can be put in such as A, B, C, D, F, or we could put words such as advanced, which would mean they exceeded the standards, proficient, means that they met them, partially proficient, or developing. For the grades, a teacher should identify ahead of time what will be graded. We shouldn't be grading every single thing that a child does. We should plan what percentage of a grade each assessment will be for, and the number of points that will be counted for that. We need to specify the grading criteria in advance, and standard-based rubrics will help with that. We need to, in advance, set up our grade books. And we need to use the same grading assessment for each student. We should grade their academic and non-academic things separately. Non-academic meaning behavior, effort, attendance. We should compose the student's performance to criterion of a specified goal or a standard. We shouldn't be grading on a curve. We need to remain objective when grading, cover the name up if necessary on the paper, and we should grade assignment by assignment, not student by student. We should remember that grades and comments on official grade cards are part of the student's permanent record. The last couple of the summary evaluations, one would be a parent conference. We should have a plan before that parent conference, list the points to be made and what we're going to open up with, examples of evidence, possible actions that the parent and school can do to help their child. We need to be sensitive to cultural diversity and family differences, and we need to communicate with the parents, not at the parents. We should be giving written progress statements, being specific, using clear and simple language, being selective, in other words, summarizing and giving them what they need to know, not every detail of the child's life. We need to be clear, straightforward, and supportive, and be sensitive to anything that we say that might be really impactful, an impactful statement towards that the parents might react to. Assessment results as a basis for home activities should be realistic and specific. And we need to look ahead. The home and school action plan for progress, it should be kept to 2 to 3 items, and it needs to be written down so the parents can actually see and remember what the plan was. And lastly, portfolio conferences. They could be child-led, and that would be like second grade and up could possibly do this, where a student presents and explains their portfolio to their parents, and a student can learn to assess their own work. Or there's teacher-led portfolio conferences, and that is where the portfolio provides an objective focus, and it speaks for itself, and the teacher points out what is significant. If a student isn't part of this conference, that student can write or draw messages to the parents to put in their portfolio, and there can also be a page for parent comment and reflection to add as part of the portfolio. We can have exhibits and displays as assessments. As exhibits are widely used in programs following the Reggio Emilia approach to education, and that was where Italian schools needed to make themselves known to their communities, so they started this up. There can be photos, sketches, narrative reports, artwork, transcripts of student conversations, work products, video recordings. Most displays tell a story of what was done during a project. And they can be in public places, school hallways, public libraries, malls, town buildings, school lobbies, you name it. We can use websites to display these exhibits and displays for relatives and friends to be able to go on and see these. And you can add a teacher email to them, maybe for comments or questions. We need to keep up communication with schools and the centers. Administrators require reports from teachers, such as attendance, concerns, permission slips, can be other as well. And the portfolio can be explained to the administration by the child, or they can have informal conversations with the child, how's it going? We need to have collaborative team meetings between the teacher, the aide, and the specialist, anyone involved with this child, to collaborate and make sure they're on the same page. Communication needs to happen with other schools and centers, especially if a child is coming from another school or moving to another school. The assessment record should accompany that student going to a different school or even the next level in the same school, so that future teachers or the next teacher can see what they were assessed with. Communication and collaboration in specialized services. Specifically involved with the pre-referral and intervention strategies. Assessment of how strategies are working, identification and diagnosis, ways to plan and deliver services to children, and to devise accommodations of modifications to assessments and instructions so that students with disabilities can be fairly assessed and taught. Collaboration of the team for assessments and decision making should happen. We need to focus on the functional needs of the student, and each member should observe and interact with students at different times in different contexts, so that we need to realize that each of us have them, they might be showing different behaviors in different contexts. We don't all have them in the same type of setting. So we need to keep that in mind. Our observations and findings should complement each other's evaluations, and we need to respect other disciplines and what those can contribute, and be open and receptive to suggestions from other disciplines. The team could be other teachers, aides, counselor, nurse, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech, audiology specialist, a transition specialist for older kids, social worker, assistive technology specialist, external agencies support people could also be involved in the team. We need to make sure we are prepared for those team meetings and use reflective listening, such as, what I hear you saying is. The teacher can work with the specialists individually as well, not just in the team meetings. Private schools may not have specialists, so they depend on the public and private community resources, such as through local health agencies, and they might use some things from the public school, some services. Professional and personal development and learning. For professional, the classroom assessment of the children and the use of that information is to modify curriculum and instruction, and it's very professionally and personally demanding, but satisfying and rewarding as well. To have personal knowledge, intuitions, and insights becomes a legitimate part of the assessment process. It humanizes those scores and grades and percentiles, and it deepens professional satisfaction. Personally, we can appreciate the complexity and mystery of human life through the assessment process. Our personal values, beliefs, and convictions come to the forefront, and we must confront our own challenges and just face those. And as teachers help their students develop and learn, they develop and learn as well.